Welcome to another presentation where we're looking at the letter written to the Hebrews. We've now reached part 7. I've given this rather a strange title, Old and New. The meaning will perhaps become apparent as we go through this presentation. Again, let's just reflect back on the previous presentation where we've been. The writer has demonstrated what Jesus has achieved. He pictures Jesus the great high priest. And a high priest gives us access to God's presence. But Jesus the great high priest brings us the reality of access to God's presence. But he suggests that the high priesthood of Jesus has similarities with the priesthood of Melchizedek, an obscure character in the Old Testament in the book of Genesis. And this throws much light on the nature of the high priesthood of Jesus. The priests in the days of the nation of Israel were all descended from the tribe of Levi. Jesus wasn't. Melchizedek, of course, predated Levi. Melchizedek didn't become a priest because he was the son of a priest. He remained throughout his life as a priest. Jesus did not become a priest because his father was a priest. He had a priesthood in his own right, and it remains with him forever. But perhaps that's the most important part. Melchizedek was a priest and a ruler, a king. And Jesus is portrayed as both a priest and a king. In the nation of Israel, the priesthood line and the kingly line were kept totally separate. Jesus, like Melchizedek, was both. Now this goes a bit beyond, perhaps, Melchizedek. But again and again the writer stresses that the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross is once for all and never to be repeated. We're simply ignoring that picture when we try to reenact it in our churches today. Jesus did it once for all. That's sufficient. It's completed, and it will not be repeated. So Melchizedek as a priest-king offers a kind of model, the kind of type of high priest to be seen in Jesus. Yes, Jesus as the great high priest, he fulfills much that can be seen in the Levitical priesthood, the priesthood line in the land of Israel. But he goes far beyond that priesthood, which is why the author has brought in Melchizedek as a better model. At the end of the last presentation we looked at 3 verses, and I suggested they were a magnificent summary of where the writer has got to that point. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priests, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men in all their weakness, but the oath, the declaration from God, which came after the law, appointed the Son, Jesus, who has been made perfect forever. Jesus deals with our human rebellion completely. A magnificent picture of the characteristics of Jesus. Holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. It's once for all. It comes in again and again in this letter. Unlike the priestly system of the Jewish nation, their sacrifices kept having to be repeated. No, Jesus died once for all humanity. And he became a priest by God's declaration, not because he was born into it. And the word perfect carries the idea of completeness. He completed everything in all he achieved. It needs nothing added to it, and it doesn't need to be reenacted. It's complete in all he achieved. Picking out these phrases, let's just hang on to that. No matter what our situation may be, Jesus truly meets our need. He deals with the rebellious human nature which is within us all, once for all. And he did that by being the great high priest who sacrificed himself willingly on a Roman cross. This is the picture the writer has developed for us. Now he uses some important words. We're going to meet them several times. The word sanctuary. We've met the word sacrifice again and again, and indeed it may puzzle us why we have to have such sacrifices. He's going to keep bringing in this word covenant. We're going to look at these words and what they mean. Let's just look at the word sanctuary for the moment. Now let's see if we can follow this through. Our human rebellion has blocked our access to God in a relationship. Do you remember the story in the Garden of Eden? The rebellion of the human couple there. God wanted the relationship and looked for them. They were hiding. And that's a picture of what's happening with humanity all the time. We think we can run our own lives our way. We can decide what's right and wrong for ourselves. We don't need God. We push God to the fringes of our existence. Human rebellion. And our genuine relationship with God is just not there. That's God's goal. He made us for relationship. Relationship primarily and essentially with himself. He wants to re-establish that relational presence. We've broken it down. He wants to re-establish it. And the sanctuary is the place where humans can gain access to God. Now it was a physical sanctuary in the ancient tabernacle in the days of Moses, or the temple in the days of Solomon onwards. But we need to think of it as a place with a physical location. The sanctuary is a place spiritually where we humans can come into relationship with the God who made us. And we find our fulfillment in that relationship. So often in our rebellion we've pushed God to the edge. We think we can do things ourselves. We don't need God. That's the way of humanity, and you can see it writ large in our modern societies today. And we lose out on what God has got for us because we were made for relationship with him. And when we cause that to break down, we simply lose out on God's best for our lives. The place, the spiritual place, the physical place, whatever, where that relationship can be restored. That's the meaning of the word sanctuary. The word covenant, much more complex, difficult to get our heads around. It's an important idea. But when you read it, you repeatedly find it's connected to death. What on earth's the connection? Now, you can have a covenant and agreement between two human beings, but let's think for the moment a covenant or an agreement between God and humans. Now, there's a phrase that's used sometimes in the Old Testament which has little meaning in English, but in the original it's cutting a covenant. And that's a picture of expressing mutuality. And it's often connected with a sacrifice of animals, in other words, death. Now, a covenant between God, the Lord of the universe, and us is always initiated by God, and he sets the terms. If we set the terms, he wouldn't know what to do. We'd make a complete mess of it. He knows what's best for us, and he only wants the best for us. He takes the initiative. We've broken the relationship, but he takes the initiative. He sets the terms, but he needs a response. It's not imposed on us. It's not automatic. It requires a response from the human side. If we respond to what God is initiating for us, we find life moves into a picture which is called blessings. We have a life of fulfillment and purpose. No matter what life circumstances might be, no matter how tough it might be, we have a security, a peace, a fulfillment. But if we don't respond positively, it describes that as curses. Now, we don't use the word curses so much in modern language, but just think of it as the opposite of blessings. We don't have things going right. We don't have that inner peace and purpose. Nothing to do with being wealthy. Nothing to do with being successful. It's something deep and inner. And if we keep on rejecting and not responding, then it goes back to death. Now, there's a deep thought here. We can have physical death. That happens to us all. But there's something much deeper here, spiritual death. We steadily lose our sensitivity to God. We've not listened to him. We've pushed him away. We think we can do things better on our own. God is pushed to the margins, and a process happens within us. We're spiritually dying. And somehow that's got to be broken if the covenant's to be restored. Now, I've put up 3 words, but you'll notice the one on the right hand is different. The word rest. Now, we looked at this in a previous presentation because it ties in with us. We'll come back to the other words, sacrifice, just in a moment. Here's several ways of looking at it. Covenant is to be seen in the context of God's ultimate goal. That's the re-establishment of his relational presence among humans. That we have a direct relationship with him. The place where that happens is the sanctuary. When it happens, we begin to enter rest. God made us, and he made us for himself. And we find our ultimate fulfillment when we're in relationship to our Creator. The ultimate fulfillment, rest. The place of re-establishing it, the sanctuary. The covenant, God's mechanism to make it possible. Now, our relationship was totally undermined by our choice of rebellion. Now, that's the choice we make as human beings. I put it this way, we think we can run our own lives better without God, and we can decide what is right and wrong for ourselves. That's the picture in the Garden of Eden, but it's a picture that's all over the whole of the biblical text. But it's a picture you can see in your television screens day by day. We think we're clever enough to take our own decisions, decide what's right and wrong, and run our own lives better, and we don't need God. We may recognize that there is a God, but we don't really need God in our lives. That's a typical human pattern of a rebellion, and the Bible's blunt about it. It is rebellion. A rebellion against our Creator. The sanctuary is the spiritual location where that relationship is re-established. The covenant is the mechanism of God's initiative to re-establish it. And when it's re-established, then we can start to enter into rest, our security in the purposes of God. We saw that rest was the idea of the will of God brought to completion. It's a spiritual state open to all of us. When we come into God's way of doing things, we share God's serenity in purpose and direction. That doesn't mean to say life is easy. That doesn't mean to say everything goes perfectly. But we have a serenity which comes from Him, because we're living in line with what He wants and what's best for us. But the ultimate goal is that. We humans are at rest only when God is in our midst and our lifestyles are reflecting His way of living. If you go to the last chapter of the Bible, the book of Revelation, you can picture that. God is amongst His people. That's the way it puts it. God is in our midst. And when God is in our midst, our lifestyles are reflecting His way of living, the best way. But then we've got this other word, sacrifice, which comes in again and again and again. The Jewish sacrificial system. Look at the amount of the Old Testament that's devoted to describing it. Then there's a lot of criticisms of it that go in the prophetic writings. It seems still to have been running when this book was being written, the letter to the Hebrews. You see, that's what we want. We think we'll be happier when we're independent, doing it our own way. And nothing could be further from the truth. It is a deception, a delusion, and we all have it in some measure. But when you break an agreement, inevitably a relationship breaks down. That happens at the human level. At the divine level, we decide to push God to the margins of life and do it our own way. Having pushed God out, we've lost something of His protection, and we expose ourselves to the inevitable consequences right here and now. And that is a thrust of the great prophetic writings of the Old Testament. But at a spiritual level, pushing God to the edge of life, running things our own way because we think we know better, we steadily lose our awareness of God in the practicalities of daily living. We're spiritually dying, and we end up spiritually dead. Death is an inevitable consequence, and that's where death appears. Let's remember that. We struggle with that when we see so many disasters in the world. The disasters are caused by humans, not by God. That's the way we humans so often go. We choose not to live His way. We think we know better. But God never stops reaching out. He's trying to draw us back to something that He knows will be better, and it is better by far. And we're drawn back in the sanctuary, the place where relationship is restored. And we have a relationship with our Creator. But He's got a route map to make it possible. We call it a covenant. He sets the conditions, seeks the responses. The covenant comes in there. And rest describes our genuine fulfillment when we're living His way and we're achieving what He wants us to achieve, which is always the best for us to achieve. It's the way He made us. He made you and me for a task, and when we don't fulfill the task for which He made us and we get into something else, we lose out on His rest. So covenant, sanctuary and rest, we're going to meet covenant and sanctuary again and again, but it ties back to the idea of rest that we saw previously. But where does that fit? That's not so obvious in our modern way of thinking. Now in chapters 8, 9 and much of 10, the writer teases all this out and develops it systematically, and is going to expand the meaning of covenant, sanctuary, sacrifice. But we need to know what the words mean and how he would be using them and how the original hearers would have got it. And perhaps we'll begin to see where it fits together and where sacrifice fits. So let's start into chapters 8 to verse 18 of chapter 10. Now here's a route map of it. People have analysed this in all kinds of ways, but here's a way that I've found helpful. 3 sections, each of which can be divided into 3. Nice and easy to remember. But that's the themes covered, and they interlock. Sanctuary, sacrifice, covenant. Sanctuary, sacrifice, covenant. Sanctuary, sacrifice, covenant. They interlock and lead to each other. He's developing our understanding. It's going down through layers and levels. He's taking us further and deeper. In the first section, he builds it on the Old Testament. Remember, he's writing to people from a Jewish background. So he starts from where they're at, the Old Testament. But he shows that the new covenant that Jesus came to bring in would be different. Then he goes on to show why the new covenant that Jesus brought was needed. The old covenant was inadequate. And then at the third layer, he now shows the complete adequacy of the new covenant that Jesus brings. So he's taking us through these 3 key words and taking us and answering and addressing questions and taking us deeper and deeper. And hopefully it'll begin to make sense. But let's remember how these words would have been understood. Sanctuary, the spiritual location where relationship is restored. Sacrifice we've got to look at in a lot more detail. Something or someone sacrificed in our behalf. Covenant, God's mechanism, the agreement he makes with humanity, where he sets it out but we have to respond. Now that in mind, let's move on now into chapter 8. Now the main point of what we're saying is this. We do have such a high priest who sat down at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, and who serves in the sanctuary, the true tabernacle set up by the Lord, not by a mere human being. Every high priest is appointed to offer both gifts and sacrifices, and so it was necessary for this one also to have something to offer. If he were on earth, he would not be a priest. He wasn't from the tribe of Levi. For there are already priests who offer the gifts prescribed by the law. They serve at a sanctuary as a copy and a shadow of what is in heaven. This is why Moses was warned when he was about to build the tabernacle. See to it you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. The tabernacle system of Moses became the temple system of the Jewish nation, was a shadow, a pattern that pointed to what was going to happen in Jesus. That's quoted from Exodus 25. But in fact, the ministry Jesus has received is as superior to theirs as the covenant of which he's mediator is superior to the old covenant, since the new covenant is established on better promises. Let's just look at bits of this. The high priest represents the people in matters related to God. That was the system of the Jewish people. Gifts and sacrifices for human rebellion and failures. That's not literalistically to be taken. It's a picture that makes the point that the task Jesus came to achieve has been completed. He's now returned to his divinity totally and completely, his rightful place. Remember, that's the location. It was physical, spiritual. Location of God's presence, where the divine-human relationship can be made real. The tabernacle and temple systems pointed to it. The reality is in Jesus. The days of Moses, it was called a tent of meeting, and that makes the point. It's a place where humanity could touch divinity through the high priest. The true tabernacle, true in the sense of genuine and real, where the relationship between God and us can be made genuine and real. That's in Jesus. That's the spiritual location. Now, there are two ideas that are held in tension right throughout this section. The author makes the point that the Levitical sacrificial system, it was inadequate because there was just endless repetition of sacrifices. Didn't deal with things once and for all. But it does provide a model for that something better. Although the model from Melchizedek adds an extra dimension. So these ideas are held in tension. It points to something better, but it was inadequate in itself. Back to our text. The tabernacle in the desert under Moses, and then the temple in Jerusalem. There was a vast amount of visual imagery. Now that's important in a people group for whom most would not read or write. It gave the people an understanding of the principles by which human rebellion can be dealt with. It taught them the seriousness of it, and it showed that the only way to deal with it was through sacrifice. In this case, the death of animals. That's the most precious thing an agricultural people would have. Their livestock. The most precious thing that you and I have is our own lives. We only get it once. It's visual imagery. And it points to something which was coming in Jesus, which was better, because it was once for all. It was complete. It was perfect. But that question still hangs around. Just some thoughts about this and pointers, and as we track through this presentation and the following one, maybe this will become clearer. Someone said human rebellion vandalizes God's world with pain and death, and you can see it on the television screens at the moment. Television has enabled us to experience the horrors of war and brutality and see them in our living rooms, and the sheer suffering of people, the dying of people. That's because we're trying to do things our own way. We think we know better, and our way conflicts with the ways of others. You end up with strife and problems. We've got to face up to that issue. That's a human frailty. Why do we continually go this way? We think we know better than God. We don't face up to the reality that we don't. And the sacrificial system set up under Moses, it helped these people then to face the reality. There was a lot of death around, a lot of sacrifice, and they were called to sacrifice the best of their animals and crops. And in an agricultural society, that is a sacrifice. We've got to come to terms with the reality that we mess things up by trying to run things our own way. Further thoughts. We rebel against God. We lose out on the relational divine presence. We've cut ourselves off from God. We've decided we can do it better on our own. That leads us down a process of spiritual death. Humanity is spiritually dying when it goes its own way. I just ponder this one. We're spiritually dying, and the only way to stop that is it requires execution of our rebellious nature. The nature that's within us that's taking us the wrong way. That could allow spiritual life to return. Now here's the connection with death, sacrifice. And it's something that in other letters Paul has spoken about. Under the Levitical sacrificial system, the sacrifice and death of that which was most precious, that's their livestock, that's a model. It points to the principle. If you and I are going to get back into a divine relationship with God, our Heavenly Father, then our rebellious nature has got to be executed. That's death, that's sacrifice. Jesus came as a representative humanity on our behalf. And he sacrificed by choice that which was most precious to him, his life. That perfect sacrifice on our behalf symbolizes the execution of our own nature. Now let's move into the second part of that chapter. For if there had been nothing wrong with the first covenant, no place would have been sought for another. But God found fault with the people and said, now there's a quotation taken from Jeremiah 31. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with the ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant. And I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbours or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Laws is a picture of God's principles of living. They'll be inbuilt within us. We'll have turned from our rebellion by his grace and strength. And relationship will be being re-established. They will all know me. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. and what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Let's just look at the first bit. Now, it's the only mention in the Old Testament of a new covenant. There's a very large number of references to covenant in the Old Testament. But this is the only one of new. But the idea of a new covenant is picked up by Paul and also by Jesus in the New Testament. Now, the word new is new in the sense of better than the alternative. Not new in terms of something totally different. And that's consistent with the way the writer has pictured things. He takes them back, Jeremiah. God rescued the people group from slavery in Egypt. When they got to the edge of the land that God promised them, they refused to go in. They thought they knew better than God. Their successors went in, but over the centuries, many generations were simply unwilling to live the way God directed. They thought they knew better than God. They pushed God to the margins of life. It ended up with God rejected. The religious system went on, but now it was token or ritual religion. And sadly, there's an awful lot of that flying around today. And it flies around within our churches. And the great prophets emphasized the point that God was not there. There was no sanctuary. There was no relationship. The people were just going through a religious tokenism system. God had withdrawn. The people didn't want him. Now, under the Old Covenant, the people group needed priests and teachers to make the link between them and God. And that was central in the temple system of sacrifice. But under the new covenant, there's no need for priests. And how we have retained them in churches is unbelievable. Because people had direct access to God through Jesus. Direct access to the nature of the lifestyle he had for them through Jesus. They will no longer teach their neighbours. They will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. It's nothing intellectual, it's spiritual. God would be their God, they would be his people. Relationship would be growing and developing. That's the new covenant. That's what Jesus came to achieve. Now, someone has put it this way: there's a central difference between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. The Old Covenant was externalized. God set up a covenant, a set of directions, and the people chose not to follow God. They chose to push God to the margins of life. They chose not to follow his life directions, whether it was be his instructions how to enter the land, or over the centuries, his instructions on lifestyle and what they were to do and their priorities. Their leadership thought they knew better. The religious leadership went along with them. Religion became ritual performance, and God's presence had been pushed out. It was externalized. But the new covenant was internalized. It's within us. It doesn't depend on a priestly system. The power of God within you and me would release within us the resources to enable us to respond to God fully. I will put my laws, life principles in their minds. I will write them on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbours or say to another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Spiritual response to God's new covenant opens the door to relationship and resources. Back to the whole section again. Now let's just look at the bit at the bottom. At the time this was written, almost certainly the Jewish temple system was still running. The writer gives no hint it's gone. But it was on its last legs. It was about to be wiped out once and for all and will not be reinstated. The first covenant was being made obsolete. When Jesus came, he brought in the new covenant, God's new route map to re-establish relationship with him. That's the sanctuary. It was done through sacrifice, the sacrifice of himself, willingly, as representative humanity on a cross. And the old covenant is obsolete and outdated, and it'll soon disappear. In AD 70, the Romans sacked the land. They took the whole temple area and smashed it to bits. Not one stone was left another, as Jesus had predicted. And the temple sacrificial system ceased, has never reappeared, and will never reappear. It's obsolete. We don't need it. It's served its purpose. Now let's bring this together. We've covered a fair number of ideas, and this is our first section of the cycle that the writer makes through these three major ideas. Sanctuary. It's the place. Used to be physical, now it's spiritual. If you call a bit of your church building a sanctuary, we've kind of lost it. We've gone back to the old way of thinking. The sanctuary is the spiritual place where humans can gain access to God. When we accept and respond to all that Jesus done for us in his life, death and resurrection, we open ourselves up to God's resources by his Spirit. And relationship with our Heavenly Father can grow and develop. That's sanctuary, and that's the real meaning of the idea. A covenant, God's route map, which he initiates, we must respond to it. God sets the terms because he knows what's best. We could never work it out for ourselves. But he seeks our response. That's our responsibility. It's not imposed on us. We need to respond to all that God has done for us in the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, and seek his way. That's the route map. And it involved sacrifice. You see, our rebellion leads steadily to spiritual death. And as we were made to be spiritual beings, that is a frightening, devastating thought. We need our old nature executed. Jesus was executed as representative man in our place. The sacrifice, the death of that which is most precious, the greatest human being that's ever lived. God himself, who entered our humanity in the life of a human being. That provides the complete restoration. We're beginning to see where sacrifice fits, at least in part, But there may be much more to these ideas, because this is the first time he's moved through this sequence of thought. He's going to move further the next two. And let's bring back the idea of rest, which comes in a previous chapter. It's open to you and me. It's a spiritual state. We're sharing God's serenity in God's purposes and directions. It doesn't mean to say life is easy. It doesn't mean to say we're all going to be wealthy and secure in a physical sense. It's a spiritual state, because we're living God's way, and we're part of God's plan and purpose, because we've asked it to be so, and He's made it possible through His covenant and sacrifice for that to happen. Ideas are brought together. But let's go back to the last sentence of the chapter. By calling this covenant new, the one He has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. Don't let us go back to old covenant thinking. Don't let us go back to ritual performance thinking that will please God. Don't let us go back to the idea where we need a priest. That's not biblical. That's not a New Testament idea. Jesus is our great high priest. And the old system is obsolete and outdated and will soon disappear, and the Jewish system did disappear, has disappeared, and has never been resurrected. That's our first look through this sequence of thoughts in chapter 8. We're going to develop further the ideas in the next presentation: sanctuary, sacrifice, and covenant.